They never heard them coming. At first, Japanese radar operators saw only a thin line on their screens, too fast, too high, and too many to be anything they recognized. Moments later, the horizon flashed with silver, and commanders stationed near Tokyo rushed to the windows in disbelief. The sky, usually dominated by their own fighters, was now filled with a wave of American aircraft they had never expected to see this deep into their homeland. P-51 Mustangs. The American fighter Japan believed could never reach them. Pilots scrambled, radios exploded with panic, and officers shouted orders that made no sense. How had these planes crossed more than 1,000 miles of open ocean? How were they already diving toward their positions? Within minutes, everything Japan thought it understood about American air power shattered, because the Mustang wasn't just another fighter. It was a nightmare delivered on wings of silver. Before that shocking morning, Japanese commanders believed they understood the limits of American aviation. For years, the vast distances of the Pacific had protected their homeland. American bombers could come, and they did, but their escort fighters always turned back long before reaching the Japanese mainland. That distance was Japan's invisible shield, a barrier no American fighter had ever crossed. Until the P-51 Mustang arrived. Born from desperation and perfected with British engineering, the Mustang didn't just extend America's reach, it shattered every assumption the Japanese military depended on. With its new Merlin engine, enormous range, and extraordinary performance, the P-51 became something entirely new, a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Japan, and still dominate any battle in the sky. By late 1944, rumors began spreading inside Japanese Air Command, stories of a new silver aircraft appearing far beyond its expected range, striking with impossible speed, and climbing higher than the Zero could ever hope to follow. Commanders dismissed these reports at first, believing them exaggerated, impossible, or simply American propaganda. But soon, they would learn the truth for themselves. Because the day the P-51 Mustangs finally appeared over Japan, nothing in the war would ever be the same again. In the early years of World War II, Japan ruled the skies of the Pacific with confidence bordering on certainty. Their pilots were elite, many trained since the 1930s, hardened through China, and sharpened by countless dogfights. The Mitsubishi A6M0, light, maneuverable, and deadly in the hands of an expert, became a symbol of Japanese dominance. Allied pilots feared it, and Japanese commanders believed it would remain unmatched for years. But by 1943, the cracks in that dominance began to show. Japan was losing something far more valuable than aircraft: experienced pilots. Unlike the United States, Japan had no large-scale training pipeline, no system to rapidly replace veterans with new recruits. Once a skilled pilot was lost, he was lost forever. And as the war dragged on, those losses became impossible to hide. Meanwhile, American production surged. New aircraft factories came online every month, training schools expanded, and hundreds of fresh pilots poured into the Pacific. Japan's once superior air force now found itself outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly overwhelmed. Fuel shortages struck next. By late 1943, Japan's access to oil was crumbling. Every minute a pilot spent training meant precious fuel burned, fuel they could no longer replace. The result was devastating: new pilots entered combat with only a fraction of the training American aviators received. Inexperienced men flew outdated Zeros against the growing might of American air power. But through all of this, one belief held strong among Japanese commanders: American fighters could not reach Japan itself. The Pacific was simply too big. No fighter had anywhere near the range required to escort bombers across the hundreds of miles separating the Mariana Islands from the Japanese mainland. Bombers could come alone, yes, but unescorted bombers were vulnerable. Japan's pilots, even depleted, could still meet them over Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and the industrial heart of the empire. This distance was Japan's last advantage, its invisible wall. And because of that belief, Japanese commanders grew complacent. They focused their remaining resources on intercepting B-29 raids, building defensive positions, and preparing their fighters for high-altitude engagements. Every strategic calculation assumed the same comforting truth. No American fighter would ever appear over Japan. But far away from Tokyo, in windswept hangars on Pacific airstrips, American engineers were working on something extraordinary. A fighter unlike anything Japan had faced before. A machine with the speed of a racer, the altitude of a bomber, and, most critically, the range to cross oceans. The P-51 Mustang. Whispers of this new aircraft eventually reached the Japanese command, but they dismissed them. No technology, they believed, could overcome the sheer geography of the Pacific. Even if the Americans had developed a better fighter, it would never escort B-29s to Japan. It was impossible. And yet, the impossible was coming for them, faster than they knew. The Pacific sky they once dominated was about to belong to someone else. The story of the P-51 Mustang begins not in an American factory, but in a moment of desperation. Early in the war, Britain was struggling to survive the Luftwaffe's relentless assault. They needed more fighters, and fast. The British reached out to North American aviation with an urgent request: design a new fighter in record time. What followed was one of the most astonishing engineering feats of the war. In just 117 days, the first Mustang prototype was complete. But the real transformation came later. At first, the Mustang was merely good. Fast at low altitudes, stable, and promising, but not exceptional. It wasn't until the British installed the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same powerplant used in the Spitfire, that the aircraft became something extraordinary. With the Merlin, the Mustang climbed faster, flew higher, and, most importantly, could travel incredibly long distances without sacrificing speed or agility. This changed everything. For American commanders, the Mustang was the answer to a deadly problem. B-17s and B-24s were being torn apart deep in Europe because no fighter could escort them the entire way. But when Mustangs began flying into Germany and back, still with fuel to spare, American strategists looked across the Pacific and realized something astonishing. This fighter could reach Japan. When paired with massive drop tanks, the P-51 suddenly possessed a combat range previously thought impossible. And when the Mariana Islands fell to American forces in 1944, airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam placed Japan directly within the Mustang's reach. The Japanese command had no idea. They continued to believe geography protected them. They focused on intercepting B-29s, aircraft they knew were coming. What they didn't expect, what they never even considered, was that those bombers might arrive with a deadly escort flying alongside them. American pilots trained heavily for this mission. They learned long-range navigation, extreme fuel management, and tactics specifically designed for high-altitude combat over Japan. Many pilots doubted they'd actually make it. Flying more than 1,000 miles over open ocean in a single-seat fighter was not just dangerous, it was unheard of. But the Mustang could do it. When the first groups of P-51s finally lifted off from Saipan, engines rumbling in the pre-dawn darkness, the men who flew them understood they were attempting something historic. They climbed above the ocean, formed up with the B-29s, and pushed deeper toward Japan with every passing minute. Hours later, as they crossed the coastline, American pilots felt the same shock their enemies would soon experience. Below them lay the Japanese mainland, quiet and unsuspecting. No fighters patrolled the skies. No anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Japan wasn't ready because Japan didn't believe it was possible. And somewhere far below, in command posts outside Tokyo, officers were preparing to intercept another B-29 raid, completely unaware that a new threat was already streaking toward them at over 400 miles per hour. The sky over Japan was no longer theirs. They just didn't know it yet. The first time Japanese commanders witnessed the P-51 Mustangs over their homeland, the reaction was immediate, visceral, and disbelieving. Reports began pouring in from outlying observation posts. unidentified fighters, fast, silver, and flying far higher than the Zero could climb. At first, senior officers dismissed the sightings as errors. Perhaps a misidentified B-29? Maybe reflections from the sun? But then, the radios erupted. Enemy fighters. New type. They're attacking the formation. What followed was chaos. The Japanese scrambling order was always precise: Zeros at the ready line, ground crews rushing to clear the runway, and pilots sprinting to their aircraft. But this time, panic replaced discipline. Mustangs were already overhead, something that simply should not have been possible. Pilots barely reached their planes before the first dogfights exploded across the sky. American pilots were stunned by the sight below them, Japanese airfields unprepared, fighters taking off without proper formation, anti-aircraft guns firing late and inaccurately. It was the complete opposite of the disciplined foe America had faced earlier in the war. Japan's best pilots were long gone, replaced by young, barely trained men who had never fought a Mustang and had never even imagined such a fight. The Mustangs wasted no time. Diving from above with the sun at their backs, they struck with speed the Japanese had never encountered. Zeros attempted to climb toward them, but the P-51 could outclimb them, outdive them, and outrun them. Where the Zero depended on tight turning, the Mustang relied on raw power. Its 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns tore through Japanese aircraft with devastating precision. For many Japanese pilots, the encounter felt unreal. They were taught that American fighters were slow, short-ranged, and inferior. Now they faced machines that moved like lightning and attacked from altitudes they could barely reach. Some pilots attempted desperate evasive rolls, others tried to lure the Mustangs into low-speed turns. But the Americans had studied these tactics. They refused the bait. Japanese radios captured the panic. They are faster, too fast. We cannot climb. Where did they come from? Meanwhile, on the ground, commanders stared at the sky in open disbelief. Through binoculars, they watched silver fighters slicing through their defensive formations with impossible agility. Officers shouted for reinforcements, but the airfields were already overwhelmed. Some units attempted emergency takeoffs, only to be caught by Mustangs before their wheels even fully lifted from the runway. And then came the moment that truly shattered Japanese command confidence. A group of Mustangs formed up with a B-29 formation, flying escort. This sight alone carried a message more powerful than any bomb: Japan's last strategic advantage, the distance of the Pacific, was gone. The shock spread through command centers like wildfire. If American fighters could reach Japan, then nowhere was safe. The Empire had lost the defensive barrier it once believed impenetrable. Officers who once dismissed reports of long-range American fighters now realized they had underestimated their enemy, fatally. In that moment, the sky over Japan no longer felt like home territory. It felt like the front line of a war they were now losing. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang over Japan did more than shock commanders, it reshaped the entire air war. Before the Mustang, every B-29 raid came with the same grim expectation: heavy losses. The superfortress was powerful, but without escort, it was vulnerable to coordinated Japanese attacks. Fighter groups waited near major cities, climbing to meet the bombers at altitude, often shredding their formations before American gunners could react. But with the Mustangs, the dynamic changed instantly. On the very first escorted mission, commanders on the ground watched their fighters struggle to break through a defensive wall of P-51s. Instead of meeting helpless bombers, they collided with aggressive American pilots hungry for revenge. The Mustang pilots didn't play defense, they hunted. They intercepted climbing Japanese fighters long before they reached the B-29s, slicing through them with ease. What had once been deadly battles high above Tokyo or Nagoya now became one-sided engagements. American pilots quickly realized they were facing inexperienced opponents. Many Japanese aviators were fresh recruits, sent into combat with only minimal flight hours and little gunnery practice. The Mustang's raw performance, its speed, climb, and stability at high altitude, left them almost no chance to fight back. And as casualties mounted, Japan's ability to replace pilots collapsed entirely. The psychological impact was even greater. For Japanese civilians, the sight of Mustangs escorting bombers was terrifying. For the first time, the American fighters were not distant rumors, they were visible over neighborhoods, cities, and military bases. Children saw them. Workers saw them. Even officers who once laughed at the idea of long-range American fighters now stood frozen as silver wings filled the sky. Japan launched several counter-strategies to stop the Mustang threat. First came the order, engage Mustangs only in groups, never alone. But with fuel shortages and few operational aircraft, forming large formations was often impossible. Many pilots were forced to scramble individually, only to be overwhelmed moments after takeoff. Next came attempts to lure the Mustangs into low-speed turning dogfights, the Zero's specialty. But American pilots had been trained extensively on Japanese tactics. They refused to turn tightly, using their superior speed to maintain the advantage. If a Zero tried to turn inside them, the Mustang simply pulled away, climbed, and dove back with devastating firepower. Finally, Japan attempted night interceptions. Radar-equipped fighters and searchlights worked together to catch B-29s in darkness. But the Mustangs adapted. They modified tactics, flying barrier sweeps ahead of bomber formations, engaging any Japanese fighter before it posed a threat. By early 1945, the result was unmistakable: Japan had lost control of its own skies. Loss statistics were brutal. Entire Japanese air groups disappeared in a single mission. American pilots reported battles where they saw more parachutes than enemy fighters. Within command centers, officers whispered the words no one wanted to speak aloud. "We cannot defend the homeland." The P-51 Mustang had done more than challenge Japan, it had broken the last pillar of their defensive strategy. And as the silver fighters soared deeper and deeper into the archipelago, Japan realized it was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to survive. When the last waves of P-51 Mustangs swept across Japan in 1945, the air war had transformed into something no Japanese commander had ever imagined. The skies that once symbolized Japanese strength, skies ruled by the Zero and guarded by distance, were now dominated by American silver wings stretching from horizon to horizon. Every pilot, every officer, and every civilian who looked upward understood one undeniable truth: the Pacific Shield was gone. For Japan's military, it was more than a tactical defeat. It was a psychological collapse. Their final defensive assumption, the belief that American fighters could never escort bombers to the homeland, had shattered in the most dramatic way possible. And it wasn't broken by slow, lumbering aircraft, it was destroyed by machines that flew with impossible speed and grace, cutting through their defenses like a storm. The P-51 Mustang didn't just escort bombers. It rewrote the air war. Its arrival meant that Japanese pilots entered the sky already at a disadvantage they could not overcome. It meant that B-29s, once vulnerable, now thundered across the empire with confidence. It meant that every Japanese commander who stood on a runway or inside a bunker, watching those silver fighters streak overhead, faced a reality they had refused to accept. Japan was no longer in control of its own skies. As the war drew to its final months, the Mustang became a symbol of inevitability. Each mission chipped away at Japan's remaining strength, each escort proving the same devastating point: America's reach was now limitless. And when historians later looked back at this moment, they agreed. The day the P-51 Mustangs appeared over Japan was the day the empire's fate was sealed. A day when the sky itself changed sides. And never changed back.